Ahoy, me hearties! You might have noticed a second ship floating around out here in space. That's because the channel just hit 2,000 subscribers, and there just wasn't enough room on one ship alone.
How many assholes we got on this ship anyhow?
Yo!
I knew it, I'm surrounded by assholes.
Keep firing, assholes!
With any luck, the fleet will continue growing. But you know what hasn't grown? My interest in the MCU. Now, I know a lot of you out there in the crew are probably MCU fans, and what I say might piss some of you off, but it has to be said. It's time for the MCU to die.
I am dying. When a man sees his end, he wants to know there was some purpose to his life.
You had a purpose, MCU. That was to entertain us with a bunch of characters that we recognize from the pages of comic books. You were supposed to tell an interconnected story that brought bands of heroes and anti-heroes together, culminating in a historic cinematic event that was to sound off like a hurricane. But instead, it just sort of fizzled like a swampy fart, and we're left to check our boxers to make sure it was just gas. Don't get me wrong, there are much worse movies than Avengers Endgame. It just didn't live up to the hype and potential of the cliffhanger that was in Avengers Infinity War. But no worries, a meh movie is not the end of the world, just the end of the franchise.
Why can't you just die? Whatever, I'll do what I want.
The MCU should have been allowed to die with whatever dignity it could muster, and it should have been rebooted or something, or just left alone. But it's being kept alive on life support because the suits at Disney smell a profit like a shark smells blood. They have a cookie cutter in the shape of a dollar sign, and they intend to use that thing to make safe, generic comfort food they can shove down our throats while pandering to the lowest common denominator. I did a quick Google search to see what they're bringing to the movie theaters, and I was utterly whelmed. Not under, not over, like I don't even give a shit enough about the MCU to even get annoyed at their decisions. They're just kind of there, like the world's most boring vampire, sucking the fun out of what was once promising and filled with life.
I am what's known as a psychic vampire, or energy vampire.
Hi, Deb.
Energy vampires drain people's energy merely by talking to them.
Actual versus... Please. Hey, Don.
Kill me.
Alright, so now that most of the recognizable characters from Marvel are either dead, or retired, or fat mockeries of their older selves, what are we left with? What characters are the MCU using in order to justify its continued existence? We are going to be treated to comic book luminaries like the Eternals.
Who?
Don't beat yourself up if you've never heard of them. Nobody else has either. That's why the studio was so ballsy about race-swapping half the cast. Nobody will give a shit. They clearly want these guys to be the next Guardians of the Galaxy, a bunch of obscure characters that turn into something fun, but those movies, the Guardian movies, took chances, and this movie looks too safe and sterile. This movie poster here ticks off all the SJW progressive boxes, so it feels about as safe and corporate as the old Burger King commercials from the 1990s.
My God, that's disgusting.
That's disgusting.
You're about to be bombarded with a recurring theme, so buckle in, me hearties.
Now buckle this.
The second Ant-Man film, Ant-Man and the Wasp, was misnamed. It should have been called The Wasp. because the entire film seemed to be all about Evangeline Lilly overshadowing Ant-Man at every turn. I'm thrilled to report that a third Ant-Man installment is set to hit the silver screen, and by thrilled, I mean watching it might be marginally more entertaining than listening to the sound of my own screams as someone smashes my nether regions. Then there's Shang-Chi, a C-list character at best, who's basically a way for Marvel to appeal to the Chinese market. Guess that didn't work out quite like they wanted. And we've got a Black Widow movie that's about 3 or 4 years too late. I'm sure it won't be bad, but it's pretty hard to give a shit about a character who isn't even alive anymore.
Nobody cares.
And then there's Thor, who is no longer Thor. Instead, the 4th Thor movie will reportedly focus on Natalie Portman, a woman who looks as though she'd struggle to lift the pen she used to ink her ludicrously priced contract, let alone the frickin' hammer of Thor. That's right, you heard me, we're getting a female Thor.
Anyone can be anything!
And since the tragic death of Chadwick Boseman, it sounds like Disney has given the role of Black Panther in the sequel to the character Shuri, who is absolutely unwatchable and unrelatable in her limited role in the previous film, being a know-it-all to the most insufferable level.
Don't scare me like that, colonizer.
You can about imagine my excitement to see her star in her own movie.
Oh, goody.
Naturally, Captain Marvel is getting another movie, but it does look like they've at least learned a lesson from the Plank of Wood's absolutely terrible first outing. Just not the right lesson, I'm sure. They learned that Brie Larson cannot carry a movie on her own, let alone the entire MCU, which is why the next movie will be called The Marvels, and Brie will only be a co-star. Seriously, you need help if you think there's any way Brie will ever be able to replace Tony Stark as the head of the MCU. The only thing more boring than her was her story in the film. The character desperately needed more conflict beyond amnesia and forgetting how awesome she was.
My name is Carol. I've been fighting with one arm tied behind my back. But what happens when I'm finally set free?
Spare me.
If you look back at that film, which I don't recommend by the way, but if you do, you'll notice what I did. There's no conflict. Not for her anyway, she just can't remember who she is. In the meantime, she just fights whoever happens to be around and looks like the bad guy. Then eventually, she remembers how awesome she is, how she's the greatest warrior like ever, and she annihilates everything around her in a power fantasy that tickled the fancy of every purple-haired yo-yo in the audience who tragically misunderstands why geeks like the stories that they like.
It's like in the great stories, Mr. Frugal. The ones that really mattered. Folk in those stories had lots of chances of turning back, only they didn't. They kept going.
I do what I want.
Guardians of the Galaxy 3 is still due to come out. That might be fun, but it's lost a lot of its luster since it will have seen the better part of a decade since the last one came out by the time this one releases. Oh, and the fact that Gamora is dead doesn't help either.
Man, that sucks!
Spider-Man has another film coming out. I'm kinda Spider-Man out at this point, but so does Doctor Strange. They're really trying to lean into this multiverse thing in both of those films, but the term is already played out, and I don't think it's going to draw in audiences quite like Disney plans. I think it will drown them, with too much exposure to the MCU. Because the MCU just isn't going anywhere. Because right now, the MCU is just boring and filled with gimmicks.
No, me bored. Bored! Rah!
Falcon and the Winter Soldier just showed us a glimpse of what they have in store for us in Phase 4 of the MCU, race swapping and political pandering to appeal to the lowest common denominator. And I gotta say, it kinda reminds me of the comic books of the 90s, which almost ruined Marvel. They had gimmick covers like holograms, variant covers, and issue number 1s released every week in order to bait people into buying. The problem was, they flooded their own market with all of these gimmicks, and they killed the interest in their own franchises. That's basically what they're doing here. Race swaps and gender swaps are gimmicks, and they'll have diminishing returns, so that eventually, Marvel will have to get back to telling stories. Unfortunately for them, the purple-haired land whales they're trying to court right now will have lost interest by the time that happens, and they'll have lost space pirates like myself long ago. I don't know who their target audience will be by then.
Oh, my friends. Friends? I thought he said we were the enemy.
It would have been more humane to stake me down and leave me to the f***ing crows.
Thanks for watching, me hearties. If you haven't already, your captain is inviting you to subscribe to the channel and become a part of the crew. Life as a space pirate may not be glamorous, but there's always plenty of